Coming home from a long business trip, the first thing I saw wasn't my house. It was a foreclosure sale sign stabbed into the lawn of the estate I paid off entirely years ago. I didn't panic. I checked the records. My parents hadn't just stolen from me with forged signatures. They had engineered a legal trap to force me to pay their debt. But they forgot one thing. I don't react with tears. I react with an audit. My name is Mila Knight. For the past 16 hours, my reality had been a pressurized metal tube hurtling over 2 continents, carrying me from the humid, relentless deal rooms of Sao Paulo back to the crisp, unforgiving air of Charlottesville, Virginia. I am the Chief Executive Officer of North Barrow Freight Systems, a logistics empire built on precision, ruthless efficiency, and the ironclad rule that margins never lie. I spend my days tracking cargo vessels across oceans and optimizing supply chains down to the minute. Control is not just my profession, it is my survival mechanism. By the time my private driver navigated the winding, fog-draped roads toward Hawthorne Vale, my private estate, the only margin I cared about was the distance between my aching body and a silk-sheeted bed. The negotiations in Brazil had been brutal. I had secured the contracts, but the victory felt heavy in my bones. I wanted silence. I wanted the absolute, unyielding security of the walls I had built around myself. I wanted sleep, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that erased the static of global commerce, shareholder demands, and the endless ringing of satellite phones. The heavy wrought iron gates parted smoothly, a silent, mechanical welcome into the sanctuary I had bought and paid for in cash several years prior. The tires of the town car crunched rhythmically against the crushed stone of the long, ancient oak-lined driveway. The landscaping was geometric perfection, the limestone facade of the manor standing stoic and elegant against the fading afternoon light. It was a flawless picture of insulated wealth, a fortress disguised as a country home. Then, a violent slash of color shattered the perfectly curated tableau. It was neon orange, staked directly into the manicured emerald lawn near the bottom of the grand stone front steps. I told the driver to stop the vehicle immediately. The air outside was biting, carrying the sharp scent of upcoming frost, but I did not feel the cold as I stepped out of the warm leather interior and walked up to the placard. Printed in bold, utilitarian black ink were the words, "Notice of Foreclosure Sale." Underneath the bold header, it listed a lender I had never once done business with, Crown Meridian Bank. It cited a county court file number. And most critically, it announced an auction scheduled to take place in exactly 13 days. 13 days. That was not a clerical error timeline. That was a timeline designed to prevent a quiet, behind-the-scenes resolution. That was a countdown to a public execution of my assets and my reputation. Most people would scream. Most people would fall to their knees on the gravel, pull out their phones, and dial their attorneys with shaking hands, their voices breaking as they demanded to know how their fully owned home was being snatched away by strangers. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on the orange plastic, breathing evenly for 3 slow beats. I do not scream. I audit. Hawthorne Vale was a free and clear asset. I possessed the deed. There was no mortgage. There was no lingering lien. It is a fundamental legal truth that you cannot foreclose on a property that carries 0 debt. Therefore, the premise of the sign on my lawn was an impossibility, unless a completely new, unauthorized layer of financial architecture had been secretly built over my name while my back was turned. A new reality had been constructed on paper, buried in county filing cabinets. I needed to see the blueprints of this lie. I bypassed the towering front doors, letting myself in through the discreet side entrance. I left my heavy leather travel bags abandoned in the grand foyer, their dull thuds echoing against the polished marble floors. I did not bother taking off my tailored wool coat. I walked straight down the long, shadowed west corridor to my study, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and woke up my encrypted workstation. The soft, rhythmic hum of the cooling processors was the only sound in the cavernous, wood-paneled room. I bypassed the standard public access portals, utilizing my clearance to log directly into the secure county clerk and land records database. my keystrokes sharp, aggressive, and rhythmic. I pulled up the specific parcel identification number for the Hawthorne Vale estate. The historical chain of title loaded slowly on the dual monitors, line by line. For years, the record had shown a single comforting phrase next to my acquisition date paid in full. Now, the digital ledger told a wildly different, chaotic story. Exactly 10 months ago, a massive financial shadow had been cast over my estate. A new deed of trust had been recorded. The principal amount secured by the property was a staggering $4.8 million. Someone had leveraged my sanctuary for nearly $5 million, and they had executed this massive transaction while I was orchestrating global logistics across 3 time zones. Completely unaware. I downloaded the scanned digital copy of the original loan documents. The pages rendered slowly, line after line of dense, standard legal boilerplate, until I reached the final page, the execution block, the signature line. There, stark against the glowing white background of the monitor, was my name, Mila Knight. I leaned in closer, my eyes meticulously tracking the curves, the loops, and the angles of the blue ink. It was a beautiful signature. It was elegant, fluid, and entirely legible, and that was exactly how I knew it was a forgery. My real signature is a chaotic, hurried slash of ink, a practically unreadable byproduct of signing hundreds of corporate authorizations a week. I do not have the patience for elegant loops. The signature on the screen was simply too right. It was a meticulous simulation, drawn by someone trying very hard to make it look perfect, entirely devoid of the kinetic, impatient energy of my actual handwriting. It was a calculated performance on paper. I scrolled further down the document to the notary acknowledgement block and the specific execution clauses. The fragmented puzzle pieces of this crime snapped together with a sickening metallic click in my mind. Below the forged signature, in the specific section designated for the authority used to legally execute the document on my behalf, were 3 words that turned the blood in my veins to absolute ice. Power of attorney. A proxy had signed this. A proxy who had managed to convince Crown Meridian Bank, a seasoned closing attorney, and a licensed title agent that they had the absolute, unquestionable right to encumber my greatest personal asset. My jaw tightened as I pulled the corresponding disbursement ledger from the closing file, tracing the wire transfer of the loan proceeds. The $4.8 million had not vanished into a shadowy offshore shell corporation or a crypto wallet. It had been wired, in a single, massive lump sum, to a standard domestic routing number. I recognized the financial institution immediately. I recognized the specific account structure. I did not even need to run a reverse search to confirm the beneficiaries, but my disciplined nature required absolute verification. I typed the routing data into my investigative terminal. The result populated instantly, glowing in cold white text. The money had been deposited into a joint checking account. The account holders listed were Paula Knight and Graham Knight, my mother and my father. The phrase power of attorney burned against my retinas, unlocking a vault of memories I had deliberately sealed. 7 years ago, a severe surgical complication had spiraled into a systemic infection, landing me in the intensive care unit for 3 weeks. Incapacitated and heavily medicated, I had directed my legal team to draft a strictly limited proxy. It granted my parents the temporary authority to manage mounting hospital expenditures and sign off on my quarterly tax filings so my corporate standing would not falter. It authorized nothing else. The very week I was cleared to return home, I had my general counsel draft the formal revocation. I watched Paula and Graham sign the acknowledgement. The document was legally dead, or so I had ensured. I minimized the forged deed and accessed the public-facing servicing portal for Crown Meridian Bank. I bypassed the standard login by entering the loan identification number printed on the county notice and my own social security number, which they had clearly provided to the underwriter. The dashboard materialized, painting a picture of calculated, brazen negligence. The account was 9 months delinquent. Not a single monthly installment had been paid since the massive initial disbursement. The late penalties and default interest alone amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. They had taken the $4.8 million in one single, frictionless wire transfer and simply walked away, leaving the ticking mechanism entirely in my name. The asset was merely days away from the absolute threshold of irreversible foreclosure. I picked up my phone. I did not dial the local police precinct. I did not call the Federal Bureau of Investigation to report wire fraud. I dialed the woman who gave birth to me. Paula answered on the second ring, the background noise suggesting a crowded, upscale dining room. I did not offer a greeting. My voice was a flat, sterile line. I told her to bring Graham and come to Hawthorne Vale immediately. She attempted to feign confusion, her voice pitching up into a performance of maternal concern, but I ended the call before she could finish her carefully rehearsed sentence. Exactly 45 minutes later, the perimeter security cameras alerted me to their arrival. A pristine, midnight blue luxury sport utility vehicle glided up the driveway, its chrome accents gleaming under the estate lights. It was a flagship model released barely 4 months ago, carrying a sticker price well over $150,000. The visual was violently insulting. They stepped out of the vehicle looking like they were attending an exclusive country club gala. Paula wore a draped cashmere coat over a silk blouse, her wrists heavy with new, thick gold jewelry. Graham sported a tailored blazer and a relaxed, deeply confident posture. There was no hurried panic in their steps. There was no shame in their eyes. They strolled through the front doors I had left unlocked, projecting the absolute certainty that their daughter, the corporate fixer, was simply going to absorb the collateral damage of their actions as she always absorbed everything else. I waited for them in the study, standing perfectly still behind my heavy mahogany desk. Graham entered first, immediately scanning the room before settling into one of the leather guest chairs, crossing his legs with infuriating ease. Paula hovered near the doorway, offering a tight, patronizing smile. I turned the secondary monitor so they could see the scanned deed of trust and the glaring details of the foreclosure notice. I did not yell. I demanded they explain the $4.8 million. Graham let out a dismissive sigh, resting his manicured hands on his lap. He did not deny it. He did not crumble into apologies or tears. He looked me dead in the eye and called it a temporary capital relocation. He explained, with the smooth, practiced cadence of a seasoned corporate grifter, that their new venture, an exclusive, adult-only luxury resort complex in Arizona, had hit a severe liquidity wall. The contractors were threatening to abandon the site, and traditional commercial lending avenues had dried up. He leaned forward, his tone shifting into something demanding and deeply entitled. He told me that raising a child of my caliber was a lifelong investment, and parents had every right to expect a substantial dividend when their own projects required a bridge loan. He actually used the term bridge loan to describe multiple counts of federal fraud and forgery. Paula stepped further into the room, her voice dripping with toxic exasperation. She accused me of being impossibly rigid. She gestured wildly to the expansive study, the expensive art, the sheer scale of the estate surrounding us. She stated that I was swimming in endless capital, that I was wealthy but functionally heartless. To her, $4.8 million was nothing but a minor rounding error on North Barrow Freight System's quarterly balance sheet. She tried to reframe the entire criminal enterprise. This was not identity theft. This was not a felony. In her twisted, self-serving narrative, this was simply a minor family misunderstanding, a temporary borrowing of idle assets that I was too stingy to offer voluntarily. I let their words hang in the cold, silent air of the study. I told them I was going to call my litigation team and hand the entire file, including the routing numbers, to the district attorney. That was when Graham revealed the true depth of the trap they had engineered. His confident facade hardened into a cold, calculating sneer. He delivered his ultimatum. He pointed out that if I formally claimed fraud, the bank would freeze everything and launch a massive, protracted legal battle. The foreclosure process would not magically disappear. It would merely get entangled in years of nasty, highly public litigation. The financial press would uncover the court filings. The board of directors at my company would see their chief executive officer embroiled in a chaotic financial scandal involving her own family and a distressed, foreclosed asset. My impeccable personal credit, the bedrock of my corporate leverage and security clearances, would be dragged through the mud and destroyed. He leaned back, supremely confident in his extortion. He told me the cleanest, quietest way out was to simply pay off the bank, absorb the loss into my portfolio, and protect my precious company. They had weaponized my own flawless reputation against me. They left shortly after, the scent of expensive perfume and profound betrayal lingering in the air of my study. They genuinely believed they had won. They believed my silence was guaranteed by my desperate need for control and public perfection. I sat back down in my leather chair, the initial shock finally crystallizing into a sharp, hyper-focused forensic clarity. I pulled the loan documents back onto the main screen, my eyes scanning past the forged signatures and the fraudulent notary stamps. I began to read the dense, highly technical legal description of the property boundaries attached to the back of the deed of trust. I read the surveyor coordinates, the meets and bounds, and the specific lot identifiers. I stopped. I read it a second time, tracing the text with my finger. A slow, chilling realization washed over me, followed by the faint ghost of a smile. The fraudsters had been meticulous with the signature replication, but they had been dangerously lazy with the county archives. The legal description attached to the massive loan was completely outdated. It referenced the original estate boundaries from 5 years ago. It did not include the massive, 30-acre eastern ridge I had annexed and formally replatted 3 years prior. The collateral description was fundamentally, legally broken. The trap they had set was lethal, but it had a massive structural flaw. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing out the fading echo of my parents' footsteps and the toxic entitlement they had dragged into my sanctuary. I did not waste a single second breathing a sigh of relief or nursing a broken heart. Emotional bleeding is a liability I absolutely refuse to afford. I walked directly back to my workstation, picked up my encrypted mobile device, and initiated a secure, closed-circuit conference line. Within 4 minutes, the distinct, sharp voices of Evan Rourke and Lena Brooks filled the quiet expanse of my study. Evan is a ruthless, high-stakes property litigation attorney who views the legal system as a battlefield. Lena is an independent, forensic title specialist whose ability to dissect public records and trace phantom assets borders on the supernatural. They are not simply vendors, they are the architects of my legal defense. I briefed them on the confrontation and the raw data I had pulled from the county servers. Through the speakerphone, I could hear the rapid, aggressive clacking of Lena's mechanical keyboard as she bypassed the sluggish public portals and dove straight into the back-end registry of the state land records. She found the first structural anomaly almost immediately. It was not just the revoked proxy document that had been miraculously resurrected from the dead. Exactly 18 days prior to the massive loan disbursement, a fresh, completely separate legal affidavit had been quietly slipped into the official property file. It was a sworn, notarized statement, legally affirming that the proxy rights were still active, valid, and fully authorized by me. Lena routed the digital copy directly to my secondary monitor. The notary signature attached to that specific affidavit looked smeared, rushed, and entirely suspect. Evan immediately seized on the structural flaw I had discovered moments before they called. I explained the discrepancy regarding the collateral boundaries. The loan file relied on an outdated plat and omitted a significant portion of the estate I had added years earlier. Evan's voice turned grim, stripping away any hope that a technicality would save me easily. He explained that while the collateral description was technically defective, it remained a legally lethal instrument. The bank held a recorded, massive lien against the core parcel of the estate, including the primary residence. The geographical error did not invalidate the foreclosure process. It simply made it a deeply complicated, toxic mess that would still result in a public auction of my home. The threat was not diminished. It was just messier. Lena continued to dig, her keystrokes echoing like tiny hammer blows. She traced the electronic fingerprints left on the closing file, hunting for the enabler. Every real estate transaction requires a licensed attorney to sign off on the title commitment and facilitate the transfer of funds. She found the attorney of record for this fraudulent loan. His name was Benton Hale. Lena read his professional history out loud, and the profile painted a picture of absolute corruption. Benton Hale had faced 3 separate, severe disciplinary complaints with the State Bar Association over the past 7 years. Every single complaint involved gross negligence in verifying the identities of signatories on high-value commercial transactions. He had somehow managed to avoid total disbarment, but he was exactly the kind of desperate, bottom-feeding practitioner a sophisticated fraud ring would utilize to rubber stamp a completely fabricated loan package. The puzzle pieces were forming a terrifying, cohesive picture, but a glaring physical link remained missing. How did they secure a signature sample good enough to fool even a cursory institutional inspection, especially since my authentic signature is a chaotic, practically illegible scrawl? I put the conference call on mute, accessed my estate's localized, heavily encrypted security server, and pulled the gate logs and perimeter camera archives. I cross-referenced the dates, focusing on the exact week the fraudulent affidavit was supposedly notarized. I fast-forwarded through days of mundane landscape maintenance crews and standard package deliveries until I hit a glaring, undeniable anomaly. A white, unmarked commercial van had cleared my heavily secured front gates. The visitor log, managed by my staff, noted the entry reason as a mandatory, high-speed internet network diagnostic test. I summoned my estate manager. He is a dignified, older gentleman who has managed Hawthorne Vale flawlessly for nearly a decade. He stood in the doorway of the study. His hands formally clasped behind his back, I asked him directly about the network technicians. His face immediately fell into a mask of deep, agonizing regret. He confessed that 2 men in generic utility uniforms had arrived while I was in London on a prolonged 14-day business trip. They claimed my corporate logistics office had explicitly dispatched them to upgrade the fiber optic lines inside my private study. Because they possessed my internal office extension numbers and knew the exact, classified itinerary of my overseas travel, he let them in. He supervised them. But he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that he had stepped out into the hallway for perhaps 3 minutes to answer a call on the main house line. 3 minutes. That was all the time required for a professional to photograph the private, hand-signed corporate correspondence I kept in the locked drawer of my desk. They had physically infiltrated my highly secure home, bypassing state-of-the-art alarms, simply by weaponizing a schedule and a uniform. They had harvested the perfect forgery model right from my own sanctuary. I dismissed my manager, assuring him with a flat, emotionless tone that the breach was the product of a highly coordinated, targeted attack, not a lapse in his daily duties. I unmuted the phone and relayed the physical infiltration to Evan and Lena. The silence on the line was heavy. This was definitively no longer a simple, pathetic case of greedy relatives making a desperate, impulsive grab for cash to fund a failing desert resort. This was a syndicated, multi-tiered criminal operation. My parents were the ultimate beneficiaries and the front-facing actors, but they lacked the technical sophistication and the raw nerve to execute this level of systemic fraud alone. They had aligned themselves with a rogue notary, a severely compromised closing attorney, and almost certainly someone deep inside the banking institution itself to blindly fast-track the underwriting process without standard verifications. Evan's voice broke through the silence of the room, sharp, urgent, and devoid of any comforting platitudes. He laid out the ultimate, devastating reality of their overarching strategy. He warned me that the forged loan and the stolen $4.8 million were merely the first phase of the operation. The real objective was the foreclosure itself. They knew my entire corporate standing, my board approvals, and my massive credit lines relied heavily on an unimpeachable personal financial reputation. Their primary hope was simple. I would panic and erase the debt myself before the scandal became public, but Evans saw the darker secondary play. If I stood my ground and refused to pay the extorted sum, they would let the estate go straight to the auction steps in exactly 13 days. Evan predicted a shell company tied to Graham would be waiting at the auction, ready to use stolen money to buy the estate back cheap. They were not just trying to rob me, they were orchestrating a hostile, completely legal takeover of my home. The assault did not manifest as legal motions or formal declarations. It arrived through the invisible, insidious network of family group texts and the hushed, heavily carpeted hallways of Charlottesville's elite social circles. Within 48 hours of our sterile confrontation in my study, Paula and Graham had fully activated their social artillery. My private mobile device began to vibrate incessantly with calls I refused to answer. To begin with, it was my mother's older sister who called her voicemail thick with sobs and ragged breaths, demanding to know how I could be so heartless as to cast my own family out into the cold over what she called a simple mix-up at the bank. Paula had spun a masterful, completely inverted narrative. In her tearful version of events, they had merely co-signed a temporary liquidity measure to help me navigate a cash flow issue, and a simple clerical error at the local branch was causing a temporary freeze. My response, according to her vicious fiction, was not to clear up the paperwork, but to draconianly evict them from my life. They did not restrict their campaign to gullible blood relatives. The psychological siege rapidly expanded into the community, targeting the various charity boards I quietly funded, and the sprawling exclusive country club where my parents spent my money playing tennis and drinking expensive gin. I began receiving carefully worded, passive-aggressive emails from church elders and the club president. They expressed deep, unsolicited concern for the holistic well-being of the Knight family. They spoke eloquently of grace, of the virtue of forgiveness, and of the paramount importance of preserving a respectable family name in polite society. Do not make a public fuss, they urged in soft, patrician, deeply condescending tones. Handle this unfortunate hiccup quietly behind closed doors. Save face for everyone involved. They were weaponizing societal decency and Southern propriety against me, attempting to suffocate my absolute legal right to defend myself under a thick, suffocating blanket of engineered moral obligation. Then came the undeniable escalation. A local, highly trafficked financial gossip blog, read religiously by the regional business elite, published a blind item on a brisk Tuesday morning. The headline was sharp, baiting, and unmistakable. It asked its readers to guess which icy, high-flying logistics chief executive officer in Virginia was quietly facing the auction block for her sprawling, multi-million-dollar country manor. There were no explicit names printed, but the geographical and professional implications were violently clear. This was not a lucky guess by a hungry journalist. Someone embedded in this conspiracy had intentionally leaked the public filing to the press. My parents and their unseen partners were not just trying to embarrass me into submission. They were actively attempting to destabilize my professional foundation and destroy my leverage. The shockwave from that single blog post hit my corporate headquarters in the city before noon. The chairman of the board for Northborough Freight Systems, a man who viewed any form of unpredictability the way a surgeon views a septic infection, requested an immediate, unscheduled video conference. We were currently navigating the final, incredibly delicate stages of renegotiating a massive corporate credit facility that would fund our expansion into Southeast Asia. He looked at me through the high-definition lens of his camera, his face a mask of polite but terrifying scrutiny, and asked directly if there were any undocumented personal liabilities or distressed assets that could jeopardize the ongoing corporate negotiations. I sat perfectly still in my executive office, my expression a carefully constructed mask of absolute unbothered calm. I could not tell the board about the gross forgery, the imminent 13-day countdown to a public auction, or the impending criminal investigation I was building. Panic is highly contagious in corporate boardrooms, and it kills deals instantly. I looked the chairman dead in the eye and assured him, with an unwavering voice, that all of my personal assets were fully secured and that a minor, entirely baseless administrative dispute regarding a property line was being handled aggressively and quietly by my private legal counsel. It was a calculated, necessary evasion, a high-wire act performed over a bottomless canyon of fraud. I did not retreat to cry in a hotel room. I returned to Hawthorne Vale and systematically transformed the grand formal dining room into a secure, fortified command center. I stripped the long, polished mahogany table of its silk runners and decorative centerpieces, covering the wood instead with heavily encrypted laptops, secure satellite phone lines, and towering, neatly organized stacks of printed legal briefs. I established a clear, ruthlessly compartmentalized chain of command. Evan Rourke handled the immediate, aggressive legal injunctions required to stall the clock. Lena Brooks continued her obsessive forensic dive into the corrupted title history. I hired a specialized forensic accountant to trace the exact, fragmented trajectory of the stolen funds, a certified handwriting expert to mathematically and visually dismantle the forged signature down to the pen pressure, and a ruthless crisis communications advisor to monitor the shifting media landscape. I issued one absolute, unbreakable directive to the entire team: total radio silence. I would not post an emotional defense on social media platforms. I would not leak sympathetic counter-narratives to the business press. I would not engage in a messy, public mudslinging contest with my own parents. Every piece of evidence we uncovered, every desperate lie they told their friends, was quietly cataloged, verified, and locked away in the vault. I wanted them to feel the profound weight of my silence. I wanted them to mistake my disciplined preparation for terrified paralysis, to let them build their arrogant confidence right up until the exact moment the steel trap sprang shut. That absolute silence paid off in the form of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. On the 5th evening of the siege, my encrypted phone chimed with a direct message from a younger cousin who had always remained quietly on the periphery of the family's toxic dynamics. The message contained a single, unedited photograph and a genuinely confused question asking what exactly my parents were celebrating out west. I opened the high-resolution image. It was a candid shot taken inside a private, dimly lit dining room at a notoriously expensive steakhouse in Scottsdale, Arizona. Paula and Graham were standing dead center in the frame, holding crystal champagne flutes high in the air, their faces flushed with victory. Surrounded by a group of men in sharp, expensive suits, they looked triumphant. But my eyes immediately bypassed their smiling faces and locked onto the background elements of the room. Draped conspicuously across the dark wood paneling directly behind their heads was a custom-printed, high-gloss vinyl banner. The text was understated but perfectly legible. It welcomed the founding partners and celebrated the official launch of Red Mesa Legacy Holdings. I stared at those 5 specific words until they burned a permanent image into my vision. I walked slowly over to the command table, picked up a thick black marker, and wrote the name in large block letters on the central glass whiteboard. I cross-referenced the name with the corporate registry database Evan had established earlier in the week. The search results populated in a fraction of a second, confirming my darkest suspicion. Red Mesa Legacy Holdings was a brand new limited liability company, officially registered in the state of Arizona exactly 3 weeks prior to the recording of the fraudulent deed of trust on my estate. The managing members were carefully obscured by a third-party registered agent service, but the timing was mathematically and logically impossible to ignore. This was the missing architecture of their endgame. Evan had predicted they would utilize a clean shell company to swoop in and purchase the estate at the public auction for a fraction of its true market value. Here it was, boldly printed on a celebration banner, a party likely paid for by the very money they had stolen from my own equity. They were not just planning to take my home and humiliate me, they were already actively toasting to their victory. They had set the stage, invited their hidden co-conspirators, and uncorked the expensive champagne. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war they had initiated. They thought they were playing a shallow game of social pressure and public embarrassment. They did not realize they had just handed me the exact coordinates of their financial bunker. The war room I had constructed inside my estate hummed with the quiet, electric intensity of a manhunt. The forensic accountant I had retained was a man who viewed corporate ledgers the way a seasoned coroner views a cadaver, searching meticulously for the fatal wound. He delivered his preliminary autopsy of the stolen funds just past midnight, projecting the complex financial schematics onto the central glass whiteboard. Out of the initial $4.8 million, the dispersion of the capital was breathtakingly arrogant and violently swift. We tracked the precise, undeniable wire transfer that purchased the midnight blue luxury vehicle my parents had brazenly paraded up my driveway. We followed a massive, seven-figure sum routed to a predatory private equity firm to extinguish a toxic, aggressively high-interest construction loan that had been suffocating their desert venture. We identified a substantial escrow deposit locking down the commercial acreage in the southwest. But the final, most damning arterial flow of cash, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, bypassed the construction site entirely. It flowed straight into the pristine, newly minted corporate accounts of Red Mesa Legacy Holdings, armed with the exact routing numbers and the corporate shell name. I breached the veil of Red Mesa. I did not rely on standard public search engines. I utilized proprietary, high-level logistics software originally designed to trace shadow ownership within global shipping syndicates. The state registry yielded the foundational incorporation documents. My father was indeed listed as a managing member, but he was not the sole architect of this entity. A second name sat quietly on the capitalization table, holding a dominant, controlling equity stake. The name was Derek Voss. I ran a comprehensive, encrypted background matrix on the individual. Voss was not a hospitality developer or a silent partner. He was an apex predator in the distressed real estate market. He was a man who made tens of millions of dollars by swooping into foreclosure auctions, purchasing bloodied, distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, and ruthlessly liquidating them. His hidden presence transformed my parents' clumsy theft into a surgical, premeditated strike. Voss provided the predatory blueprint. My parents merely provided the vulnerable asset. The secondary monitor at the end of the long mahogany table flickered to life. Lena Brooks had bypassed the immediate crisis of my title and started running deep algorithmic searches on Benton Hale, the disgraced closing attorney who had rubber-stamped my fraudulent transaction. She had isolated his specific closing portfolio over the past 36 months. She found 3 separate, distinct real estate transfers bearing the exact same genetic markers as my own nightmare. 3 pristine, high-value estates, 3 absentee owners, 1 expatriate working in Singapore, 1 elderly widow confined to an exclusive memory care facility, and 1 corporate trust. In every single instance, an outdated or aggressively vague proxy document had been miraculously produced to authorize a massive cash-out refinance. Every single loan had defaulted within 12 months. Every single property had gone to the auction block. Benton Hale was not merely incompetent. He was the vital, licensed administrative bottleneck for a specialized, highly lucrative real estate theft ring. The final, most terrifying layer of the conspiracy arrived not through a database search, but through an encrypted, secure communication drop my crisis management team had established online. It was a meticulously detailed message from a former compliance officer who had recently separated from Crown Meridian Bank. The source had recognized my name on the leaked financial blog and decided to clear their conscience before the federal authorities inevitably became involved. The whistleblower explained that a loan of that staggering magnitude, executed entirely via proxy by an absentee owner, should have automatically triggered at least a dozen internal security audits and mandatory manual verifications. None of those institutional tripwires had activated. The entire underwriting file had been manually overridden, flagged as a high-priority executive courtesy, and force-pushed through the final approval queue by a specific vice president of underwriting. Her name was Marisol Kent. My parents had not cleverly tricked a massive financial institution. They had actively purchased one of its gatekeepers. I stood up from the table, my mind racing through the terrifying, frictionless efficiency of their network. I walked to the towering windows overlooking the dark, sprawling front lawn. My eyes drifted to the exact spot where that neon orange placard had been violently shoved into the earth days ago. I turned back to the towering stacks of legal briefs, quickly flipping to the county sheriff's official service logs that Evan had legally obtained that afternoon. I cross-referenced the precise date and timestamp of the court's physical writ generation against my own security camera footage of the man hammering the sign into my grass. The mathematics were absolutely impossible. The foreclosure sign had been planted on my property exactly 24 hours before the county clerk had legally authorized its release. The breath caught in my throat as the sheer, calculated malice of that specific timeline washed over me. That sign was not a mandatory legal notification, it was a psychological weapon. Someone deep inside their chain, likely Marisol Kent or Derek Voss, had orchestrated an illegal, premature placement of the warning. They knew exactly when I was landing from a grueling international flight. They wanted that blazing orange threat to be the very first thing my exhausted eyes saw. It was a perfectly engineered shakedown, meant to bypass my logic and strike directly at my central nervous system. They wanted me terrified, humiliated, and desperate enough to quietly wire the stolen funds back to the bank to save my corporate reputation before I ever thought to actually look at the structural integrity of the paperwork. This was a sophisticated, fully industrialized criminal business model. My parents were merely the disposable, front-facing marks who had eagerly supplied the raw material. If I unleashed my legal team right now, if we filed a massive civil injunction citing the fraud, the entire syndicate would instantly vaporize into the shadows. Benton Hale would claim a tragic clerical error. Marisol Kent would point to a convenient system glitch. Derek Voss would dissolve Red Mesa and vanish entirely. My parents would be left holding the smoking gun, facing decades in federal prison, and the systemic rot would survive intact to target someone else. I could not just block the punch. I had to pull every single one of them into the center of the ring, lock the doors, and let them incriminate themselves simultaneously. I needed them to feel arrogant. I needed them to believe the psychological siege was actually working. I picked up my mobile device. I opened the messaging thread with my father, staring at the toxic, triumphant garbage he had been sending me all week. I carefully constructed a response, stripping away my usual sharp, unyielding syntax. I adopted the tone of a deeply exhausted, cornered executive who was finally buckling under the agonizing weight of public exposure. I typed out a message stating that the board of directors was demanding a clean resolution, that I could no longer afford the ongoing scandal, and that I was formally ready to discuss a quiet, structured repayment plan to clear the debt immediately. I did not hesitate. I pressed send. I was willingly stepping deeper into the jaws of their trap, ensuring that when I finally burned it all to the ground, they would all be standing inside. The conference room at Evan Rourke's private law firm was a theater designed for intimidation. Heavy mahogany walls, soundproofed glass, and an absolute absence of natural light. I sat at the head of the long table, waiting for the two people who gave me life to walk into a trap they could not see. Under the strict statutes of Virginia law, recording a conversation requires the consent of only one participating party. I had given my consent. A microscopic, high-fidelity audio receiver was embedded in the binding of the legal pad resting casually in front of me. I was not there to argue. I was there to let them perform. When Paula and Graham finally arrived, they practically vibrated with smug victory. They interpreted my invitation as a total surrender. I played my part flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump. I adopted the hollow, exhausted cadence of a corporate officer terrified of losing her empire to a public scandal. I told them the board of directors was threatening my position. I confessed that I could not endure the media scrutiny of a public auction. I looked down at my hands and told them I would absorb the catastrophic blow. I would personally pay off the massive bank debt to make the impending nightmare disappear. Paula reached across the table, her hand resting on my forearm in a grotesque display of maternal comfort. Graham simply leaned back in his leather chair, a satisfied smirk cementing itself on his face. Then, I slid a thick, meticulously bound stack of paper across the polished wood toward them. I called it a family indemnity agreement. I explained, in a quiet, defeated voice, that my personal accountants required a structured repayment plan on paper simply to justify the massive, sudden withdrawal of capital from my investment portfolios. I told them I would front the money immediately, but they needed to legally commit to reimbursing me over a period of 12 months. The document was a masterpiece of legal poison. It was not a repayment schedule. It was a comprehensive, legally binding confession. Embedded deep within the dense, bureaucratic terminology were clauses designed to destroy their plausible deniability. One specific paragraph required them to explicitly confirm the exact destination of the stolen capital, naming the Arizona desert venture. Another clause forced them to acknowledge their direct receipt of the multi-million-dollar wire transfer. The absolute kill shot, however, was a buried stipulation requiring them to confirm they fully understood the revoked status of the proxy authorization at the exact moment they presented it to the bank. Graham picked up the heavy gold pen sitting beside the document, but he hesitated. His predator instincts, honed by decades of grifting, flared just slightly. He began to skim the dense paragraphs, his smirk fading into a look of deep annoyance. He tossed the pen down, refusing to sign immediately. He crossed his arms and told me I was being entirely too dramatic, insisting that paper trails between blood relatives were insulting. He leaned forward, attempting to assert his dominance, and made the fatal error of trying to prove how untouchable he truly was. He scoffed and told me I should not be angry with them at all. He stated, clearly and loudly for the hidden microphone, that the banking institution was entirely complicit. He bragged that the underwriter had seen the updated, restricted file, knew the paperwork was highly irregular, and gleefully pushed the massive disbursement through anyway, just to secure their origination fees. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but my pulse hammered against my ribs. He had just handed me the audio confirmation of the internal bank conspiracy. I pushed back gently, maintaining my facade of the wounded, overwhelmed daughter. I told them the logistics of executing the loan without my physical presence must have been an absolute nightmare. Paula, inherently incapable of letting Graham hold the spotlight, immediately lost her temper. She felt insulted by my implication that they were struggling. She leaned over the table, her voice rising to a shrill, defensive pitch. She snapped that they were highly resourceful. She screamed that they had even gone out of their way to hire a specialized mobile notary to come directly to their location and help them process the paperwork quickly so they would not miss the bank's strict funding deadline. The room went completely silent. I stared at her, my expression hardening from defeated to absolute, terrifying stone. During our entire confrontation at the estate days prior, and throughout every single piece of correspondence since, I had never once mentioned the existence of a notary. I had never brought up the forged seal. She had just volunteered her direct, undeniable interaction with a crucial member of the criminal syndicate. I stood up, leaving the unsigned agreement on the table. I told them the meeting was over and walked out the door. I did not need their signatures. I had their voices. While they were sitting in that room digging their own legal graves, Evan Rourke was executing a synchronized, devastating strike across the city. Within minutes of our meeting commencing, his litigation team formally served a massive, aggressive legal hold on Crown Meridian Bank, the disgraced closing attorney Benton Hale, and the specific office of the Notary of Record. A litigation hold is a legal tripwire of the highest magnitude. The absolute second those documents were served, any attempt to delete an internal email, shred a visitor log, or wipe a digital server transitioned from a standard cover-up into a severe federal crime regarding the destruction of evidence. We had frozen the battlefield. I bypassed my corporate office and drove straight to a secure, heavily monitored laboratory on the industrial outskirts of the city. The forensic document examiner I had retained on an exorbitant retainer was waiting for me in a dark room illuminated only by harsh, specialized spectral lights. He had not just looked at the forged signature on the deed of trust. He had placed the document under extreme magnification, analyzing the exact pressure of the pen strokes, the specific chemical composition of the ink, and most crucially, the physical impression of the circular notary seal stamped at the bottom of the page. He pointed a laser pointer at a massive, high-definition monitor displaying a microscopic view of the stamp. He explained that every legitimate notary stamp possesses microscopic, unique imperfections, much like a fingerprint. He had pulled the official, registered exemplar of that specific notary seal from the state archives and overlaid it against the stamp used on my fraudulent loan. The lines did not match. There were severe, microscopic deviations in the ink distribution and the rubber molding. He turned off the laser and looked at me with a grim, intensely focused expression. The preliminary results were terrifyingly clear. The physical stamp used to press that ink onto the paper was a counterfeit, or more likely, it belonged to a completely different stamp that had been officially reported lost or stolen several months prior to the transaction. It was a ghost seal, but to prove it definitively in a federal courtroom, to completely shatter the syndicate's armor, he told me we needed to secure the one piece of evidence the criminals would likely kill to protect. We needed to physically seize the notary's original, handwritten public journal. The air inside the county courthouse was thick, smelling faintly of lemon floor wax and decades of nervous sweat. I sat perfectly rigid on the rigid wooden bench of the gallery, watching Evan Rourke systematically dismantle the fraudulent loan file in front of a pragmatic, deeply exhausted Superior Court judge. We were seeking an emergency, ex parte temporary restraining order to freeze the impending public auction. Evan presented the forensic document examiner's preliminary findings regarding the forged signature and the micro-deviations in the notary seal. He laid out the completely illogical chain of title and the violently expedited underwriting process. It was a masterclass in aggressive property litigation. It was also, tragically, not enough. The judge peered down from her elevated bench, her expression sympathetic, but legally unyielding. She acknowledged the severe irregularities, but she stated that the burden of proof required to halt a legally recorded foreclosure process mere days before the gavel fell was astronomically high. Our evidence, while deeply troubling, was entirely circumstantial without a full, protracted discovery phase. She could not, as a matter of law, block the banking institution from exercising its contractual right based on preliminary, unsworn expert opinions. The sharp, wooden crack of her gavel echoing through the cavernous room was the sound of my immediate legal defense collapsing. The injunction was denied. The auction clock continued to tick loudly toward zero. The psychological fallout from that ruling was instantaneous and suffocating. A localized legal defeat never stays localized. It bleeds into every facet of your existence. By the next morning, the financial media had moved past blind items. A prominent business journal published a highly speculative piece detailing the failed injunction, heavily implying that North Barrow Freight Systems was being led by an executive drowning in undisclosed, toxic personal debt. My board of directors convened an emergency session, their patience evaporating. I spent 3 agonizing hours on a secure video link, projecting absolute titanium confidence, assuring them that my personal capital reserves were more than sufficient to absorb the blow if necessary, shielding the corporate entity from any collateral damage. It was a calculated performance, demanding every ounce of my willpower to keep my voice from shaking with rage. Simultaneously, the family syndicate sensed blood in the water and escalated their emotional warfare. My phone became a toxic repository of familial betrayal. An aunt left a venomous, weeping voicemail, accusing me of being a cold-blooded sociopath, entirely willing to let an administrative banking error render my elderly parents homeless simply out of spite. I did not respond. I cataloged the audio file into our evidence database. Then came the direct, brazen digital extortion from Paula and Graham. They sent a coordinated barrage of text messages, their tone shifting from defensive to aggressively patronizing. They told me the clock was running out. They explicitly urged me to wire the $4.8 million directly to the bank's clearing account immediately. They framed it as a necessary business expense, a minor penalty I had to pay to save my precious corporate reputation and stop the public bleeding. They were too arrogant to realize they were digitally documenting their own coercive leverage. Every single text message they sent was another undeniable count of financial extortion, neatly packaged and time-stamped for the federal prosecutor. I maintained absolute narrative control, replying only with vague, non-committal acknowledgments of their demands. However, wars of attrition are rarely won purely on defense. I needed an offensive weapon, a piece of historical truth so absolute that no amount of slick legal maneuvering could obscure it. I bypassed my current corporate legal team and initiated a massive search for Janice Pell. Janice was a brilliant, relentlessly meticulous estate attorney who had drafted my emergency healthcare directives and financial proxies during my severe medical crisis 7 years ago. She had since retired, retreating to a quiet, heavily wooded coastal town in Maine, far away from the brutal corporate arenas. It took my private investigators 12 hours to locate her secure contact information. I arranged an encrypted video conference with her early the next morning. Janice appeared on the screen, her silver hair pulled back sharply, her eyes just as piercing and analytical as I remembered. I laid out the entire, horrifying architecture of the fraud, detailing how the temporary proxy she had drafted a decade ago had been miraculously resurrected to mortgage my estate. Janice did not express shock. She expressed profound professional outrage. She stood up, walked into a climate-controlled archive room she maintained in her private residence, and pulled the original wet ink master file for my estate planning. She returned to the camera, holding a pristine sheaf of heavily watermarked paper. She did not just possess digital scans, she held the absolute, indisputable origin documents. She read the specific limitation clauses of the original proxy authorization aloud. The legal language was breathtakingly narrow. It explicitly, unequivocally prohibited the proxy holders from encumbering, selling, transferring, or leveraging any real property or massive capital assets. The proxy was restricted entirely to routine medical billing and standard tax filings. Even if the document had somehow remained active, the massive commercial loan they executed was fundamentally, structurally illegal from its inception. But Janice delivered the fatal, killing blow seconds later. She produced the formal letter of revocation I had executed upon my recovery. Clipped securely to the back of that heavy stock paper was a faded, green certified mail return receipt. It was the postal document proving the legal revocation had been physically delivered to my parents' residential address. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at the ink scrawled across the delivery signature line. The signature belonged to Graham Knight. He had personally signed for the certified delivery of the revocation. He knew, with absolute, documented legal certainty, that his authority had been terminated 7 years ago. He had signed for the corpse of that legal document, and then he had buried it, waiting for the perfect moment to dig it back up. The momentum shifted violently back to my command center. I routed Janice's digitized files directly to Evan's secure server. Minutes later, Lena Brooks broke through the encrypted audio channel, her voice tight with adrenaline. She had abandoned the sluggish property registries and pivoted to municipal police blotters, hunting for the notary of record, Laura Finch. Lena hit a massive, undeniable strike. Exactly 12 days before the $4.8 million loan was officially notarized and recorded, Laura Finch had walked into her local police precinct. She had filed a sworn, formal police report stating that her official professional bag, containing her commissioned rubber seal and her legally mandated public notary journal, had been stolen from the trunk of her vehicle while she was grocery shopping. Lena overlaid the police report against the forged deed of trust. The specific, unique serial number registered to the stolen seal in the police database was an exact, perfect match to the ink stamped next to my forged signature. The syndicate had not just bribed a sloppy notary, they had utilized a stolen, legally compromised seal to execute a multi-million-dollar federal crime. I sat back in the heavy leather chair of my command center, staring at the interconnected web of absolute proof glowing on the monitors. I possessed the entire, devastating picture. I had the explicitly narrow proxy limits, the certified proof of revocation, the forensic timeline of the stolen notary seal, the whistleblower evidence of the compromised bank underwriter, and a documented trail of digital extortion from my own family. Evan urged me to unleash the arsenal immediately, to file a massive federal racketeering lawsuit and drag the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the bank's lobby before the day ended. I looked at the countdown clock running on my secondary monitor. The public auction was looming in a matter of days. If I struck now, the syndicate would scatter into the wind. The bank would claim ignorance. The closing attorney would plead administrative failure, and Derek Voss would dissolve his shell company and vanish, leaving my parents to take the isolated fall while the true architects escaped. I did not want a messy, protracted civil settlement. I wanted an execution. I instructed Evan to hold every single piece of evidence. I would let them march right up to the absolute edge of their victory. I would let them stand on the steps of the courthouse, completely exposed to the public and the media, holding the matches they intended to use to burn my life to the ground. And then, I would lock the doors. The heavy oak doors of the Commonwealth Club insulated the private dining room from the noise of the city, creating an atmosphere of hushed, velvet-lined privilege. It was exactly the kind of sterile, high-society environment my parents revered, making it the perfect stage for my final performance. I arrived 45 minutes early to orchestrate the environment. Evan Rourke was already seated in the adjacent, dimly lit private alcove, a glass of expensive bourbon resting untouched in front of him. A discreet earphone connected him directly to the microscopic transmitter taped securely against my ribs beneath my silk blouse. Evan had already scripted the boundaries of the conversation I was about to initiate. I was not there to argue. I was there to surrender, and in doing so, hand them the shovel to dig their own federal graves. When Paula and Graham were escorted into the room by the maitre d', their posture radiated an obnoxious, overwhelming arrogance. They believed the legal siege had finally broken my spirit. The morning financial blogs had dragged my corporate reputation through the mud following the denial of the temporary restraining order, and they assumed I was bleeding out professionally. I stood up, allowing my shoulders to sag infinitesimally, adopting the hollow, defeated cadence of an executive who had finally reached the absolute limit of her endurance. I invited them to sit and skip the small talk. In a low, controlled voice, I repeated the surrender story they expected to hear. The board was pressuring me. The scandal had to disappear, and I was prepared to settle the lien by morning. I let them believe I was finally breaking. Paula immediately leaned across the table, offering a sickeningly sweet smile of maternal absolution. She reached out to touch my hand, a gesture I allowed simply to maintain the illusion. She told me I was finally making the rational, mature choice. Her guard dropped entirely, intoxicated by the taste of total victory. I looked at her, my eyes perfectly wide and vulnerable, and asked the question that Evan had highlighted in red ink on my briefing notes. I asked her what they would have done if I had not caved, if I simply did not have the liquid capital to cover their massive theft. Paula let out a short, dismissive laugh, waving her hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. She stated, loudly and clearly into the hidden microphone, that they knew I would never actually let it go that far. She admitted their entire initial strategy was predicated on my desperate need for public perfection. They assumed I would quietly clear the fraudulent ledger at the 11th hour just to protect the company. It was a risk-free extraction in her eyes. Nobody was actually supposed to get hurt because I was always going to pay the ransom. It was the perfect confession to the primary extortion plot. But I needed the secondary architecture. I turned my attention to Graham, who was currently swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet. I hardened my tone just a fraction, injecting a note of authentic bitterness. I challenged his absolute certainty. I asked him what would have happened if I had decided to call his bluff and let the estate fall to the auction block the next day. Graham could never resist an opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, a predatory glint in his eyes. He eagerly explained his failsafe, his brilliant backup plan. He confirmed that they fully intended to let the foreclosure proceed if I refused to pay. He then proudly detailed how a freshly incorporated entity named Red Mesa Legacy Holdings was perfectly positioned to swoop into the county courthouse and purchase Hawthorne Vale for a mere fraction of its appraised market value. And then, he delivered the ultimate, sickening twist of the knife. He smiled and told me I would not have to move out. He planned to offer me a heavily inflated, ironclad commercial lease agreement. They were going to use the money they stole from my equity to buy my home, and then force me to pay them rent every single month to live in it. It was a masterpiece of financial sadism, and it was now permanently preserved in high-fidelity digital audio. Right as Graham finished his triumphant explanation, the heavy dining room doors swung open again. A man walked in unannounced, moving with the sleek, unapologetic confidence of a corporate predator. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit and possessed eyes that evaluated everything in the room as a depreciating asset. Graham stood up immediately, beaming, and introduced the man as his primary business partner in the Arizona venture. It was Derek Voss. The appearance of Voss was the ultimate, unforced error on their part. Graham had invited him to celebrate their victory a day early. Voss extended a hand toward me, his grip dry and excessively firm. He offered a condescending smirk and stated he was looking forward to finalizing our new landlord and tenant relationship once the auction concluded the following afternoon. In less than 3 minutes, Derek Voss had physically placed himself at the absolute center of the conspiracy, validating his role as the architect of the distressed asset takeover and confirming this was a heavily premeditated syndicate operation, not a spontaneous family dispute. While Voss was busy celebrating his impending real estate acquisition, a completely different kind of strike was occurring in the digital realm. The moment Voss confirmed his identity on the audio feed, I shifted my weight in my chair, pressing my arm against my side in a prearranged signal. In the adjacent room, Evan Rourke tapped a single key on his encrypted laptop. Miles away, a massive, heavily encrypted data packet was simultaneously transmitted to the personal email inbox of the Chief Compliance Officer at Crown Meridian Bank and the direct emergency portal of the State Department of Financial Regulation. It contained the meticulously documented proof of the revoked proxy, the certified mail receipts proving Graham's knowledge of the revocation, the police report detailing the stolen notary seal, the forensic microanalysis of the forged stamp, and the undeniable digital trail of extortion. The reaction inside the upper echelons of Crown Meridian Bank was not a public statement. It was a silent, violent internal implosion. We later learned that executives were pulled from their beds. The Compliance Division recognized the immediate, catastrophic threat of a federal racketeering investigation. Within 45 minutes of receiving our data drop, the bank's internal security team completely locked down the system architecture. Marisol Kent, the compromised underwriting vice president, found her digital credentials instantly revoked and her security badges permanently deactivated. A massive, red-level internal audit was triggered to locate every single file she had ever touched, but Crown Meridian was terrified of the impending liability. They initiated the internal purge quietly, desperately trying to contain the blast radius before the federal regulators arrived at their lobby. They issued no press releases. They made no phone calls to the fraudulent borrowers. Back in the private dining room, the dinner concluded with fake smiles and empty promises. I stood up, shook hands with the men who were actively trying to destroy me, and walked out into the cool evening air. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold, absolute calm. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed softly in the darkness. It was nearly 10 at night. The county foreclosure auction was scheduled to commence at exactly noon the next day. There were less than 14 hours left on the clock. My parents were currently ordering a second bottle of vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that the bank financing their entire hostile takeover was currently burning to the ground from the inside out. The morning of the auction broke with the sharp, blinding clarity of an execution day. The air was brutally cold, carrying the metallic scent of impending frost and gasoline. By 7:30 in the morning, the absolute worst-case scenario regarding the leaked financial blog post had materialized directly beyond my heavy iron gates. 3 distinct satellite news vans from regional business networks were parked aggressively along the gravel shoulder of the county highway. A small, hungry cluster of reporters holding microphones stood near the stone pillars, their camera operators aiming massive, long lenses through the wrought iron, desperately hoping to capture the exact moment the icy corporate chief executive officer was physically evicted from her multi-million-dollar fortress. I knew with absolute certainty that the board of directors for North Barrow Freight Systems was currently watching those live feeds from their sleek glass conference rooms, waiting to see if my empire would crumble on live television. The reputational pressure was no longer an abstract concept floating in financial reports. It was a physical barricade at the edge of my property. I watched them through the high-definition security feeds from the darkened command center in my study, sipping black coffee, feeling the immense, crushing weight of public humiliation pressing against the glass. Less than 2 hours later, the predators arrived to claim their prize. Graham's pristine, midnight blue luxury sport utility vehicle glided past the press barricade, flashing a practiced, confident smile at the flashing cameras as if arriving at an exclusive charity gala rather than a brutal foreclosure block. He stepped onto the manicured gravel of the front drive alongside Derek Voss and a slick, sharply dressed man I recognized instantly as a high-priced corporate defense attorney. They possessed the arrogant swagger of men who had already spent the winnings. Graham firmly believed, right down to his marrow, that I was currently inside the house, frantically authorizing a massive wire transfer before the clock struck noon. Paula emerged a moment later, wrapped in expensive cashmere. She immediately spotted the 2 distant cousins she had specifically invited to witness my supposed capitulation. She instantly launched into a tearful, softly spoken monologue, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She spun a tragic, deeply manipulative narrative for her captive audience, lamenting that they were simply trying to protect the grand family legacy from my reckless, cold-hearted mismanagement. I walked out of the heavy front doors and stood on the top step of the manor, entirely rigid, offering absolutely zero reaction to her theatrical performance. While the circus assembled on my front lawn, a synchronized, desperate legal assault was unfolding downtown. Evan Rourke was physically standing inside the cramped antechamber of the county judge's private chambers. He had not slept in 2 days. He was not asking for a polite scheduling conference. He had filed a massive, heavily documented emergency motion demanding an immediate, total stay of the auction. He was armed with the absolute truth, the certified postal receipts proving Graham knew the proxy was dead 7 years ago, the official police report detailing the stolen notary seal, and the devastating, legally obtained audio transcript of Graham and Voss explicitly outlining their premeditated hostile takeover inside the country club. Evan was fighting a brutal war of inches, aggressively lobbying the exhausted court clerk, demanding she push the massive legal binder onto the judge's desk before the sun reached its apex. The heavy wooden clock on the courthouse wall ticked loudly, mocking his every word. Simultaneously, Lena Brooks and my lead forensic document examiner were mounting a parallel, highly technical blockade at the county sheriff's administrative office. They were standing directly in front of the senior deputy tasked with overseeing the public auction schedule. Lena slammed the massive, architectural blueprints onto the wooden counter, aggressively pointing out the fatal, material discrepancy embedded deep within the fraudulent deed of trust. She pointed to the already documented defect in the collateral description and warned that proceeding with the sale could expose the county to immediate liability for transferring unencumbered land. The most terrifying variable, however, was the absolute silence from the financial institution itself. Our massive data dump the previous night had clearly triggered a catastrophic earthquake inside Crown Meridian Bank, but corporate behemoths move with agonizing, bureaucratic slowness. A black, unmarked sedan had pulled into my driveway shortly after Graham arrived. 2 men and 1 woman wearing severe dark suits stepped out. Standing quietly near the perimeter of the lawn, they were the bank's internal fraud and compliance strike team. They were physically present, observing the chaotic scene, but their arms were crossed. They had not yet received the ultimate, final authorization from their executive board to legally intervene and halt the proceedings. They were waiting for a single phone call from their headquarters. The tension in the air was absolutely suffocating. Every single countermeasure I had deployed over the past 2 weeks was currently hanging in the balance. If the judge delayed reading Evan's brief for 10 minutes, if the sheriff decided the topographical error was a problem for the eventual buyer, or if the bank's legal department hesitated for even 5 minutes, the entire estate would legally change hands. As the digital clock on my phone shifted to 11:45 in the morning, Graham's arrogant facade finally began to fracture. The absolute silence from my end was driving him insane. He expected me to be begging, negotiating, or crying on the steps. Instead, I stood like a stone statue. He broke away from Voss, marching up the stone steps with his lawyer trailing closely behind. His face was flushed with a mixture of anger and rising panic. I could see a faint bead of sweat forming at his temple. He pulled a thinly bound document from his tailored jacket pocket and shoved it aggressively toward my chest. He demanded I sign it right there on the porch. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. He told me, his voice carrying clearly across the driveway, that if I signed the paperwork guaranteeing absolute silence and total legal immunity for him and Paula, he would generously instruct Voss to step back from the bidding and allow me to quietly pay off the debt without a public spectacle. In his desperate attempt to secure his own legal immunity at the final hour, standing directly in front of the bank's internal investigators, his own lawyer, and the scattered family members, he had just actively confirmed the extortion plot out loud. I let the thick paper document fall from his outstretched hand to the stone beneath my feet. I did not say a single word. I looked past his shoulder toward the base of the long driveway. The county auctioneer, a stout man in a gray suit, holding a thick clipboard, was walking methodically toward the front steps. He checked his heavy gold watch. He cleared his throat, raising his voice to cut through the crisp morning air. Formally announcing the commencement of the public sale for the Hawthorne Vale property, he raised his right hand, preparing to read the opening bid for the $4.8 million lien. At that exact, terrifying second, the encrypted mobile phone clutched tightly in my right hand began to vibrate violently. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed an entirely unknown, out-of-state area code. It was the precise digital call I had been waiting for since the very first moment this nightmare began. I did not raise the phone to my ear. I pressed the green accept button, immediately toggled the speakerphone function to maximum volume, and held the device out in the crisp morning air. The auctioneer paused, his mouth half open, as a sharp, authoritative voice echoed across the stone steps of Hawthorne Vale. The man on the line identified himself as the Executive Director of Global Fraud and Compliance for Crown Meridian Bank. His tone was not apologetic. It was urgent and legally absolute. He announced, loudly enough for my parents, their attorney, and the hushed crowd of relatives to hear every single syllable, that the financial institution had verified multiple counts of catastrophic, systemic fraud within the origination file. He officially ordered the immediate, unconditional suspension of the foreclosure proceedings. Before Graham could even process the words echoing from the speaker, the three silent figures in dark suits, who had been observing from the edge of the driveway, moved with synchronized precision. The lead investigator bypassed my father entirely and approached the county auctioneer and the deputy sheriff. She unsealed a heavy manila folder and handed them a court-stamped, emergency corporate injunction. She stated clearly that the $4.8 million deed of trust was flagged as a severe federal crime scene and was entirely ineligible for legal enforcement. The auctioneer read the first paragraph, lowered his clipboard, and slowly stepped back down the stairs. The public sale was officially dead. The blood drained entirely from Graham's face, leaving him a pale, trembling shadow of the arrogant man who had demanded my signature seconds earlier. Derek Voss took one look at the bank investigators and immediately took a calculated step backward, instinctively distancing himself from the blast radius, but I was not going to let him retreat into the shadows. I turned to face my parents, raising my voice so it carried clearly over the gravel drive. I told them I was not just saving my estate. I turned to Voss and named his newly minted shell company, Red Mesa Legacy Holdings, out loud. I looked at my shocked, whispering relatives and detailed the exact recorded conversation from the private club the night before. I exposed the entire, premeditated architecture of their trap, how my mother and father conspired with a predatory investor to manipulate a public auction, steal my equity, and force me to rent my own home back from the very people who robbed me. The bank's lead investigator did not give them a single moment to breathe. She turned to Graham and Paula and delivered the corporate death blow. She informed them that as of 8 o'clock that morning, Crown Meridian had permanently frozen every single domestic and offshore account tied to their names. They were actively clawing back the remaining escrow deposits in Arizona and revoking every active credit facility connected to their venture. She coldly added that the bank's internal legal division was currently drafting a massive civil litigation suit to recover the dispersed capital and was legally mandated to hand the entire unredacted file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation before the end of the business day. The sound of tires crunching aggressively on the gravel drew everyone's attention back to the massive iron gates. Two unmarked sedans bearing state government plates bypassed the news vans and parked at sharp angles near the fountain. Representatives from the State Department of Financial Regulation stepped out. I had notified them exactly when the bank would strike. They announced they were currently executing simultaneous, synchronized raids to seize the physical registers of the compromised notary and the heavily corrupt closing attorney, Benton Hale. Furthermore, the bank investigator confirmed that Marisol Kent, the compromised underwriting executive, had been physically escorted from the bank premises that morning, her digital footprint sealed under a strict federal data preservation order. The syndicate was being systematically dismantled in real time. The absolute reality of his impending federal indictment finally shattered Graham's remaining ego. The polished, manipulative patriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified old man. He lunged forward, ignoring the bank officials, and grabbed the railing of the stone stairs. He begged me to call my legal team and stop the onslaught. He frantically offered to legally transfer the entire Arizona resort project over to my corporate portfolio. He offered me every single share of his remaining equity if I would just retract the digital evidence and tell the authorities it was all a terrible familial misunderstanding. Paula completely abandoned her poised, victimized persona. She burst into genuine, ugly tears, clawing at her expensive cashmere coat, begging me to let everyone go inside the house, to close the heavy doors, and to fix this quietly as a family. I looked down at the two people who had weaponized my love, my trust, and my absolute dedication to my company. My voice was a flat, unyielding blade. I delivered my final boundary. I told them I would not cover a single cent of their fraudulent loan. I would not sign any non-disclosure agreements to protect their reputation. And I would absolutely not intervene, legally or financially, to save them from the catastrophic consequences they had meticulously engineered for themselves. I told them to leave my property before I instructed the sheriff to arrest them for criminal trespassing. Derek Voss was already walking swiftly down the driveway toward the gates, abandoning his co-conspirators to the wolves. Graham and Paula stood frozen, surrounded by the disgusted stares of the relatives they had invited to witness my downfall. Realizing that the fortress they had tried to steal had just become their absolute ruin, they slowly turned and walked toward their expensive, fraudulently purchased luxury vehicle, looking incredibly small and utterly defeated. Hours later, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Virginia sky in bruised shades of purple and dark orange. The local news crews had packed up their cameras and departed, chasing the incredible twist in the story. A lone estate worker walked quietly across the manicured front lawn, gripped the thick wooden stake of the orange foreclosure sign, and ripped it violently out of the earth. I stood in the grand foyer of Hawthorne Vale, listening to the heavy iron gates slide shut, sealing the world away once more. The silence was absolute, but it felt entirely different now. It was no longer a heavy, oppressive isolation. It was a hard-won, impenetrable peace. I turned and walked down the long, shadowed corridor toward my study, fully understanding a profound, terrifying truth. The greatest threat to an empire is rarely the ruthless competitor waiting outside the walls. The true danger always comes from the people who believe they inherently hold the keys to your life, simply because they share your blood. If you were standing in my shoes on those stone steps, holding the absolute power to destroy or forgive, what would you choose? Would you save your family, or would you save the truth? Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.